to have been invited to speak at Sangam Talks. It's a distinguished forum, and I thought it would be a good platform to discuss an unwritten, previously unwritten, a forgotten rather, chapter of Indian history. And it's significant in the course of the current times. You know, this book was published in February 2020, so it's not been very long. It's just been 4 months and a little more. And it so happened that when the book was published, it was a forgotten chapter in Indian history that had to be told to the people. So we went out to the market. The book was out. It was received very well. People liked it because this is something very different. It had changed the narrative between India and China. What happened thereafter in March was that the Chinese forces moved to the LAC, close to the LAC on the side, and it led to a tussle. So suddenly, the reference for a book on India-China became Watershed 1967. And then I realized, because this was the recent book that had been published, I realized, you know, there are these current issues and there are issues in 1967. The more the issues began to develop in Galwan, Pangong Tso, and the areas around, the more I realized that there were similarities of certain nature between 1967 and 2020. Now, it may seem odd to you why I would say this for two events that are separated by half a century or more. There are reasons, and you will find the similarities quite striking. Striking in the sense that, you know, if I were to recount a few of those, in 1967, and I'll come to the book, 1967 the book talks about the battles that had happened on the watershed at Nathula and Chola. It was again an area where the Chinese had attacked first, like in 2020. It was again an incident where the Chinese casualties were not told to their people. And subsequently, you know, when things came out, it was known that over 1,000 casualties had happened on both sides, and about 500 plus on the Chinese side, including Nathula and Chola, or 400 odd at Nathula itself. Here too, the Indian casualties were known. The Chinese casualties were not disclosed to their people. Very similar. Why? You will see the reason. You know, you had a period of Deng Xiaoping and Li Peng and the other Chinese leaders in between. But on both sides, 67 and 2020, you have a Chinese leader who's revisionist, dictatorial, overambitious, and aggressive. There was Mao Zedong in 1967, and there is Xi Jinping in 2020. Similar. The other aspect I found very similar between the battles of 1967 and 2020 was the use of psychological warfare. So much has changed. The more things change in China, the more they remain the same. Communism has, the dictatorial communism that used to be there in 1967 still finds its space today. And the way the Chinese government went about it and the entire psychological machinery that was used, much bigger scale now, of course, with the global information space and platform that they have. But again, the tenets, the philosophy, the principle, the approach, very similar to 1967. I will also give you another similarity, which people are not very much familiar with, is that in 1967, the battles had come a year after a Doklam incident had happened. The first time Doklam happened was in 1966. We know of Doklam in 2017, but it had happened in 1966. Relations went down the hill, and in 1967, the battles happened between India and China. 2020, if you look back, Doklam happened in 2017. Not that there are two, these are happenstances, but they also reflect the approach, the general trajectory of the relations between India and China at that time and now. So you see there are these similarities that are separated by over half a century. Coming to the book, just to get you a sense of where we are and what does this mean, these are two ancient civilizations locked in a dispute over their understanding of the line of actual control. The first one, which shows the India-China border, and you will see the extent of the line of actual control. But if you see, it's a long, border, 4,000 kilometers, approximately, and that is the kind of border, 3,500 kilometers, and that is the kind of border, line of actual control that is there between India and China, and it's divided into three zones: the western, the central, and the eastern sector. What we see today is an issue that has happened on the western sector. What happened in 1967 was on the eastern sector, that is near Sikkim. If I go to the next slide, so if you look at what happened now. One was an issue at Ladakh, Pangong Tso, Galwan Valley. We are all aware of it. The second slide onto the other side shows a tussle that had happened sometime back this year, a month and a half back, at Nakula. There were three places. One was Lipulek, where the Nepalese and the Indian sides had a dispute over road. Nepal objected to it. There was Pangong Tso and Galwan, where Indian and Chinese forces had a clash. And there was one in Nakula, in North Sikkim. Now, Sikkim is on the eastern side of the India-China line of actual control. 1967, the battles happened at the border of Sikkim and Tibet. Remember, Sikkim was not a part of India at that point of time. So this is just to set the situational context as to what happened, where it happened in 1967. Now, if I were to talk about the book is essentially, I started to explore. There is a history about 1971 where India defeated Pakistan and Bangladesh was created. There is history written about 1962 where India suffered setbacks against an aggressive China. There is history written about 1965 where India prevailed over Pakistan. But what drove me to understand more about the period between 62 and 71 was that were two reasons. One is to understand, what transformed a military and political leadership that had been defeated in 1962 to emerge as undisputed victors in 1971. What had happened in this period? Yes, of course, the 1965 war with Pakistan had India doing very well. And for the first time launching a counterattack on another country as a part of defending itself. But the larger issues, the change in psychological approach and the emergence of a decisive leadership had happened in 71. So I wanted to understand what had transpired in that period, number one. Number two, there is always, I spoke about Doklam 2017. There was always, and I go back to Doklam 2017, is because when I was watching the India-China tussle at Doklam, which is in Bhutan actually, I realized that most of the conversations and discussions were around the 1962 defeat. The references to any India-China narrative was 1962. That drove me to write about a victory that had not been recorded as a book. It had been recorded in a blog or written in an article or mentioned somewhere. But essentially, it was not a part of the India-China narrative, which had dominated the psyche of every Indian. The India-China, the dominant narrative was the 1962 narrative. The aim, therefore, was to write a history where India had prevailed, But largely, history books had ignored that. So that was the second reason. And when I started writing the book, I realized that the story essentially starts in 1965. Because when the whole world was focused on an India-Pakistan war in the Western sector, there was something else going on in the Eastern sector at the border of Sikkim and Tibet. Remember, Sikkim was not a part of India at that point of time. And China had just, in the 1950s, they had come and occupied Tibet. So given that, there was a larger scheme in play between China and Pakistan, that Pakistani forces will come into the valley, occupy Srinagar, and Chinese forces will come into Sikkim. And there would be a barter in which Sikkim would be returned in exchange for giving Kashmir to Pakistan. However, that plan did not succeed because the Pakistani forces never made much headway. And India counterattacked and moved into Sialkot, close to the doors of Lahore. The Chinese, though, had mounted pressure at Sikkim on the eastern side, trying to force India back. That is where one of the most important, underrated, but historically significant decisions were made. One of the decisions that was made at that point of time was by General Sagat Singh. General Sagat Singh was the 17 Mountain Division commander in Sikkim. And, remember, it was 1965, 3 years after India had suffered heavy reverses against China. The psychological makeup of the political and the military leadership was not very sound, given that China was playing in their minds. And so there was pressure from China for India to withdraw from the watershed line. Watershed line meant the top of the ridge which separated India and China. And if you withdrew from the watershed line, you had to, roll back to a lower height down the hill. And that would give China an advantage of occupying the watershed. So there were two places, Nathula and Jelepla. Nathula was under General Sagat Singh. Jelepla was under another division, under another general, General Harcharan Singh. As per the plan, when the Chinese pressure developed, Jelepla, which was occupied by the other forces, 20 Div, the Indian Army, they had withdrawn. 27 Div. So they had withdrawn from there. But General Sagat decided not to withdraw, not to move back. Now, today's times, we might consider it as rather, disputable or disagreeable, or sometimes we'd wonder, why would we leave the heights and come down? But remember, that was a time when there was extreme psychological domination by the Chinese over the entire Indian leadership. But General Sagat defended his decision. He decided not to withdraw from Nathula. That's an underrated decision because you'll see how it develops. So if he had withdrawn from Nathula, the Chinese forces would have come and sat at Nathula and would have had only to roll down and capture Gangtok and Sikkim and cut down India at the Siliguri corridor, which we will see in the slides that I show you later. And that would have meant that in 1971, they would have cut off India at the Siliguri corridor, which is about 25 kilometers at its maximum width. And if they'd done that, they would have linked up with the East Pakistani forces that were there in Bangladesh, current Bangladesh, at that time, East Pakistan. Those Pakistani forces they would have linked up with, and India would have been cut off. The mainland of India would have been cut off with its northeast. So that would have happened in 71. But this happened in 65. And remember, it was a very different time where Sikkim was not a part of India, and you had a monarchy in Sikkim. So you had Palden Thonduk and his wife, she was an American, Hope Cook. They were close to General Sagat, but they also had their own ambitions of being carving out a separate state for themselves. Sikkim had its own ambitions. Sikkim also had rather hot and cold relations with the government in Delhi at that time. The Chinese were also trying to prop up Sikkim, like how we see Nepal being, propped up by China at various levels. The leaders supported. China was trying to do the same thing with Sikkim at that point of time. So Sikkim was not a part of India, and that was something that was also vulnerable, a vulnerable point for India. Indian army used to be present in Sikkim. The defense of Sikkim was a responsibility of India, but the governance was the responsibility of the monarchy that prevailed over there. So General Sagath, he decided to not move back from Nathula. That created a lot of pressure on him from everyone, because there was a view that the Chinese could now come and displace India, push back India, attack India. So the period between 1965 when the Chinese wanted General Sagath and his forces to pull back, and the 2 years from 1965 to 67 were fraught with so much tension. Indian patrols were attacked at the line of actual control. There was a lot of firing from China onto the Indian posts. All of this had happened to create that kind of pressure, to mount the kind of drive and force and pressure on India to withdraw. General Sagath withstood all of that. Remember, China had also grown to be a nuclear power in 1964, had tested its nuclear device, had become significantly powerful, and wanted to extend the dominance that they had achieved in 1962 through Pakistan in 1965, and then continue to mount and apply pressure in between 65 and 67. I wouldn't go into every aspect of the book. I would like you to read the book. That would be wonderful. But I would just, talk about what happened, the major things. The relations between India and China had deteriorated to such an extent that there was an incident where the diplomats, Indian diplomats in Beijing, were accused of spying, and they were held back. They were detained. Mrs. Indira Gandhi had done the same thing for the Chinese diplomats. It was a tit for tat, which led the nations close to a war at that point of time. This was in early 1967. Things were going bad. The Chinese were helping the Naxalites in Naxalbari, in North Bengal, just few hundred kilometers from Sikkim. The Naxal uprising had started. There were violent incidents, aided and abetted by China at that point of time. So all those things had started. In 1966, as I said earlier, the Chinese forces had moved to Doklam and had mounted pressure on India at that point of time. And India had stood its ground even then. So those things happened in the aftermath of the 1965 war, and as we proceeded to 1967. 1967, the battles, I would, again, the book details the battles, what happened, how did they take place, who all participated. But the fact is, 1967 was, it started because of a dispute. Before the battles, General Sagath decided to lay down a wire fence which separated India and China. Because why would he do that? Because the Chinese patrols, like now you see at Doklam, you see at Galwan, and it has been happening at several places along the LAC. You would have read over the years, especially with the advent of Xi Jinping, that Chinese patrols do come across to the Indian side. It used to happen a lot, and at that point of time as well. So when General Sagath objected, he said, we'll put a wire fence that separates the India-China border. The Chinese objected. I will show you the exact location at that point of time at Nathula, where these disputes were taking place. The slide would show you the specific place in Nathula. Yeah, so the Chinese had installed, for instance, I'll take you through some of these slides so that I can show you what was happening at that point of time. These are pictures from 1967. And the Chinese had installed a large portrait of Mao Zedong. This was a part of their psychological warfare tactics to mount pressure in India. They had loudspeakers installed there talking about how the Indian state had subjugated the soldiers, and they were lower paid and they were not very well paid, taken care of by the government, etc. So they had lots of these propaganda machinery working overtime for them. So this was one of the things that was there at the line of action control. They had a large picture of Mao, and they had communist propaganda blaring through the loudspeakers that were put out there. So this was something that what was one of the significant aspects of the battles of Nathula and Chola. When the dispute over the laying of the wire fence took place, they led to the battles. The battles were, again, like now, they were started by the Chinese forces. And at the end, the Indians had prevailed. How had that happened was because General Sagat had ordered the use of artillery, despite the fact that the orders for the use of artillery would have had to come from New Delhi, but the Chinese had launched into a barrage of machine gun fire and had killed a lot of Indian soldiers. There was no time left for General Sagat to really go back to Delhi and obtain permission. So he knew that, for him to defend his territory, he needed to take a call. It was a leadership call that General Sagat took, and a leadership dilemma, if I may put it this way. He had either to obey a protocol, which meant going to Delhi and taking their orders for use of artillery fire against the Chinese, because that is the only way the Chinese would have been defeated, because the artillery, India had an advantage where the artillery guns could reach the Chinese positions and demolish them. And not to have used them would have been a travesty. So General Sagat had a dilemma where he had either to follow a protocol, established protocol of the organization, or attend to the higher call. The higher call was the protection of territorial sovereignty of his country. And he took that call. He ordered the barrage of artillery against the Chinese, and they completely demolished the Chinese bunkers, the positions, and alongside the actions of these soldiers and their small arms with these machine guns, and overall domination was achieved in that Battle of Nathula. What would have happened? And 15 days later, I'll come to that, another battle took place at Chola, where India prevailed again. Now, this is a slide that shows us, and I said that Sikkim was not a part of India at that point of time. China had its eyes on Sikkim. If Sikkim had been captured, what would have happened? If you see this, Sikkim is this little thumb that goes up, which has been marked in a checkered squares, and it sticks into China. If Sikkim had been captured, India, as I said, would have been exposed, because the Siliguri corridor, which is this narrow neck called the chicken's neck, or it's like a squeezed paste from a toothpaste tube. It's that little neck that goes up and then goes into the northeastern states. The northeastern states would have been cut off in 1971 in the war that India had with Pakistan, and which was essentially in Bangladesh. And as I said, Chinese troops would have linked up with the Pakistani troops in East Pakistan. So that is something that was prevented by those battles, by General Sagat's actions of staying put at Nathula and fighting those battles in 1967. It also meant that, if Sikkim had been annexed by China, we would have not had the border at Sikkim. We would have had the border at Siliguri. So can you imagine that we would have been on the plains, and the Chinese would have actually, even if they had not cut us off at Siliguri corridor, they would have dictated terms forever in history by threatening to cut us off and getting us to do their bidding. So this was the, these are pictures. I'll run you through those pictures. These are pictures of the wire fence being made at Nathula. There was a Grenadiers battalion that was there at Nathula, which was working on creating this wire fence. There was a detachment from a Rajput battalion, which was called in to fight at Nathula. There was an engineers detachment which was there as well. So this had happened at that point of time, and when the wire fence was being made, the Chinese had objected. They had a few disagreements. There had a few, they had come to blows. The Chinese had a political commissar, and political commissars are very high up in their army because the army is essentially a political army. It's a communist party organ. So the political commissar had been roughed up, which annoyed the Chinese. They went back and started to, open a fire. So all those things happened, and that's what led to the Battle of Nathula on 11 to 15 September. So this is again fiction. I wanted to show you, how the Indians were constructing the wire fence, and the Chinese were visibly disturbed, were annoyed, disturbed, irritated, and the various pulls and pushes and brush-ups that happened in the lead up to 11 September finally led the sides to open a fire, the Chinese opening up first. This is an incredible shot. The Chinese and Indian soldiers were up against each other, and they had been arguing, they had been jostling. And remember, this is not 2020 where you can get a camera from various devices to take pictures. This was from 1967, and this was taken by somebody there, and it was preserved. This is again when the two sides, before 11th of September, when the battle broke out, they had a few jostles and their arguments, and this was one of the times when they had become very close to actually bayoneting each other, and things were not looking very happy at that time. It was things would have gone down the hill at any point of time, and that's where the leadership of General Sagat came into focus. He prepared for what would happen, which it eventually did when Nathula, the Battle of Nathula broke out and the Chinese opened fire. He had anticipated that the next level of Chinese aggression would be opening up with fire, because they had been denied their, they had been denied what they wanted to do by an Indian force that was very determined to hold its ground, to not give the Chinese an inch. And China was coming off the 1962 victory, which meant is arrogant, cocky. They wanted to make sure that India will stay back, and thought that they would dominate India, which unfortunately they were wrong. So Nathula was the battle lasted 4 days, and once General Sagat used the artillery and the Indian army sort of turned the tables, the Chinese were defeated. They suffered heavy losses. Their logistics lines that came to Nathula were damaged, and their tents, their bunkers, and they had suffered a crushing defeat. It was something that was unthinkable for the Chinese. They had never suffered this kind of a defeat ever. That was the first time. Remember, they had won the Korean War in 1953. They'd done very well. 1962, they had defeated India. And that 1967 Nathula was also the first time in a series of Chinese defeats that would occur in history. That is why it was also significant. The Chinese thought that it was a flash in the pan for India, that the Indians somehow got lucky. So on 1st October, just a couple of weeks after this, the Chinese mounted another aggression at Chola, which was, some distance away from Nathula on the same axis. And at Chola, there was a Gurkha battalion of 11 Gurkha Regiment, which was there, which had just replaced another battalion of another regiment. So the Gurkha battalion had an argument with the Chinese counterparts, a minor argument again over a boulder, stone, and the Chinese had bayoneted one of the Gurkha NCOs. This is an incident that my book starts with. And the book starts with the action of this young soldier that you see on your screen, Rifleman Devi Prasad Limbu. Devi Prasad Limbu had grown up hearing the stories of brave Gurkhas demolishing the Japanese in the Second World War. He'd heard these stories, he'd grown up, and he wanted to be part of the Indian Army. He joined the 11 Gurkha Rifles. Now, 11 Gurkha Rifles is a history that it was formed in 1948, and one of the few regiments, that was one of the first regiments actually, infantry regiments to have been formed or raised after India attained independence. And in 1948, this Gurkha regiment was formed from, from all the soldiers who refused to go to the UK Gurkhas, the British Gurkhas, but instead wanted to stay behind and be a part of the Indian Army. So soldiers from the 7th and 10th Gurkha Rifles regiments decided to stay back in the Indian Army, for whom a regiment was raised, that was the 11 Gurkha Rifles. And this battalion was newly raised. It was the first time it was there at the border. Like at Nathula, you had the 2nd Grenadiers, which had a great history. And Colonel Rai Singh of 2nd Grenadiers had led his battalion along with Major Bishan Singh, was the company commander in Nathula, to defeat the Chinese. So 2nd Grenadiers was a part of a glorious regiment. 11 Gurkha Rifles was a new regiment. And the battalion had come, 711 Gurkha Rifles, had come to, which was, of which Devi Prasad Limbu was a part, had come to Chola only a few days before. And the Chinese thought this was an opportunity to crush a new battalion, a battalion that has come just to the line of actual control, relieving the existing battalion, which had moved for a few days. So they thought this is a battalion that doesn't know the area around, is new, doesn't have the full quota of ammunition delivered to them at the moment. This is the time, this was an opportunity to take revenge for Nathula. My book starts with Devi Prasad Limbu's actions, which actually laid down the template of the battle to follow. Devi Prasad Limbu was a young 21-year-old, and what he did was quite incredible. Because his colleague was shot, his colleague was bayoneted, Devi Prasad Limbu waded into the Chinese, and he killed 5 Chinese and soldiers using his kukri. And by the time a bullet had shot him and got him, and got him killed, he had actually dented the Chinese psychologically. I think that was the start. That was the start of the Chola battle, but that somewhere left a deep impression on Chinese minds. The Chinese were quite severely dented in that battle, though they fought well. And eventually, India, the Indian Army prevailed there as well, and again used an RCL gun, which was used by another soldier who had come from Mao after training on his RCL, and he had used it on the Chinese. One of the things that we saw at Nathula was also prevalent here: quick action, tactical nose by the Indian soldiers, by the Indian army leadership there, and firmness of resolve. The Chola, battle ended when the battalion commander and his officer both led the troops and recaptured the Chola post, which had been for a moment taken by the Chinese. So Colonel K.B. Joshi was the battalion commander, and his adjutant, Captain Narayan Parulikar, and his troops they moved up and recaptured the post and pushed the Chinese back. This had a great effect on the Chinese. And I think, moving away from more of the tactical side, I just wanted to kind of take you through what happened in those areas, which had been recounted in the regimental history books of 11GR, of 2nd Grenadiers. I wanted to bring that out, talk about it, let the country know as to what had happened in those battles of 1967. This is something that had an impact on the time to follow. And as I said, in 1971, the Chinese forces were not allowed to interfere in the India-Pakistan war. A lot of history is spoken about India and Pakistan, but the war of 1971, but not much is asked about why the Chinese didn't interfere. There are several reasons. The Soviets lined up 48 divisions against the Chinese at their borders, which prevent the Chinese from withdrawing the forces from there. This is a reason that is academically recounted and well known. One of the other reasons, underrated, is the decision of General Sagat to stay put at Nathula at the watershed in 1965. Remember, I spoke about this at the early part of my talk. The General Sagat had decided to stay put there, and that eventually resulted in the Chinese not being able to really move and cut off India during the Bangladesh war. Also, what happened is 1967 laid down the foundation for the India-China narrative, reworked the India-China narrative. The dominant narrative was the China victory of 1962. Here, 1967 relayed that narrative. And that narrative was that India was not the India of 1962. We say that today. But this was actually, 1967 had actually changed that. Once it changed the 1962 narrative, it resulted in several standoffs with China. And in each standoff, India has come out on top. One of the things that I recollect is 1986, and which is there in the book as well. Some of you may be aware of the incident at Sondorongchu, wherein General Sundarji had again used the same elements from General Sagat's playbook. And those elements were about using speed and surprise to completely surround the Chinese. The Chinese had come and sat at the at Indian post as they usually do. But what General Sundarji had done is he had taken an entire brigade and surrounded the Chinese, occupied the heights, and pushed the Chinese back. And this had happened in 1986 without firing a shot. And that led to the Chinese inviting Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in 1987-88, and he had gone to China and the accord had taken place. So a political decision is always preceded by a military initiative. And with China, this is more true than any other country. This is in just the book, the implication of 1967, changing the entire narrative of India-China. It also, let's remember, that China has never won a war or a battle after that. Nathula was the first time the Chinese were defeated ever, because before that, Mao had formed the nation, and 53 in the Korean War, they had prevailed over the Americans. 62, they had the better of us. 67, we had the better of them. 69, and that started the trend. Chola, they lost after that. Nathula started the trend. They lost at Chola. They lost in 1969 in the battle of Usuri to the Soviets. They didn't interfere in 1971 because they were unsure. And again, at the end of the decade in 1979, they were upstaged by the Vietnamese. So China, over the last 58 years actually, has never, ever fought a battle and won it. So that's something significant that Nathula and Chola did. Push China from participating in any battle. And from there on, the Chinese strategy has been to always posture hard, use psychological dominance, use the propaganda machinery, but has never been, they've never deployed themselves tactically for a battle or a war. So that's something that has changed. as far as Chinese approaches are concerned. Of course, you can argue about several other reasons, but if you want to look at a historical marker, this is one. Coming to what the process of the book, some of the things that I get asked as to why this was not disclosed, why this was never told. There are several reasons. One that I believe is that 1967 came at the back of our defeat in 1962. So psychologically, we were not very much prepared to accept. And I spoke with officers and soldiers who participated in the 1967 battles. And they told me that, when they went back home, people were not very certain they'd actually achieved that feat. The media hadn't covered it as much as they should have, because I think it was carried in footnotes and forgotten. Also, let's remember it was a military leadership victory. And where I've seen, wherever there is lesser political participation in a battle or a war, the recording of that battle or a war is not as significant, or is not recorded as significantly as it should be. What I mean is, in 1967, though the India-China relations had been at its lowest ebb, and the Prime Minister had taken strong actions against the Chinese espionage incidents in early 1967, the battles of Nathula and Chola were military victories undertaken under the leadership of General Sagath and his decision to use the artillery against the Chinese. The victory at Chola, again the bravery of the Indian soldier, the leadership at the local military commander level, really came good. So there was, it was not very well documented in terms of how it should be, in terms of its recording in history. It was also challenged in the parliament. People started asking questions as to why we had lost soldiers. So the mindset was quite different. 1971 came soon after and whitewashed everything that had happened before. So 3 essential reasons: the psychological makeup, the fact that it was a military victory more than a political victory. Though there was a political leadership that was very strong at that point of time, but on the ground, it was essentially a decision that was taken by General Sagath that had changed the course of the battle. And 1971, wherein India achieved a resounding victory, the kind of which hadn't been seen in history after the Second World War, where the enemy had sat down and signed a surrender document. So those things completely whitewashed the victory of 1967. And over a period of time, it was forgotten. Those reasons I felt were possible reasons, were possibly the reasons why the victories were never recounted later. One of the things I remember when I started off on the journey of writing the book was the fact that in India, we do not have disclosure norms. We don't write our history, haven't written our history as much as we should have. And one of the things I remember is a lot of the history of 1967 had to be acquired by talking to people, by relying on articles of newspapers at that time, by looking at a blog or a write-up of a former general or a former analyst who had written about it. Apart from these little bits and pieces of articles, blogs, accounts of people, there was not much that was existing in the secondary domain. So I had to rely on that. I had to talk to people, spoke with people, traveled across places, and you'll be surprised that Colonel K.B. Joshi, for instance, if I were to give you an example, he's 95. I went to meet him in Dehradun, and he recounted the Battle of Chola. His memories were so robust and so strong. They were quite incredible that he could recount everything in such great detail. I also met, say for instance, Tenjong Lama, who lives in Lamahata, in a little village in Lamahata near Darjeeling, where I went to visit him and spent the day listening to his account of the Battle of Chola. Or General Randhir Singh, who was a former ADC to General Sagath, who I met in Rajpipla near Baroda, and he was gracious enough to walk me through the entire through General Sagat's career and what happened. He'd written a biography of General Sagat. And then General Sagat's family kept speaking with them, kept speaking with some of the other participants, Captain Parulekar, for instance, Major Krishan Singh, Grenadiers. So these are people who I kept meeting. I took their versions, and I was surprised that, people had very robust memories, which really helped in putting together the account. One of the things that I must say here is that, when you write a book, you start with a premise, and the premise was 1967. What I realized over a period of time while writing the book was that there was more to it. There was much more to it, and that's what led me to 1965. That's what led me to 1971, the implications. And the last one was the integration of Sikkim with India in 1975. That was because this Chinese threat to Sikkim remained paramount. And it was the government of the day that decided that Sikkim needed to be integrated with India in 1975. And today, when we look at the Chinese designs and ambitions, perhaps that move was timely. And if you look back at the events of 1967 and 65, the Chinese designs on Sikkim were very clear. So there are these aspects of history that as I went along, I also discovered that there was a crisis game played in the US, and wherein they had planned for the capture of Sikkim by China, and Chinese forces going into Gangtok, and Pakistani forces coming to the valley. And this was a crisis game played in a war game played in the US at a think tank institute in early 1965. And they also predicted a war between India and China in September 1966 in exactly the same manner. And that actually got preceded by a year. I write about it in the book, why I think that plan was preceded by General Ayub Khan, who was the president of Pakistan at that point of time. But there are several of these nuggets which go on to create this saga of 1967. And one of the things I realized, the other takeaway when you do a research on a non-fiction event of history like this, is the roles played by people. And General Sagat, who remains one of the greatest battlefield commanders that has ever been there. I'm not talking about India alone. One of the greatest battlefield commanders of the century. And we have not given him the rightful place. He is arguably the greatest battlefield commander that India has produced. General Harbaksh, General Sagat, and some of the others. General Sagat, to me, stands out for several reasons. And I have said that in the book as well, though this is this is from outside the precincts of the 67 battles. Is General Sagat's contribution to India's integrity, territorial integrity is immense. 1961, he was involved. He led the operations at Panaji in Goa. He was involved in that, in the capture of Panaji. 1962, he was kept out of the Chinese war, India-Chinese war. 1965, he pushed back the Chinese at Nathula. 1967, he won 2 battles. 1969, he established the Counterinsurgency Jungle Warfare School, because the man had a foresight that insurgency is going to be the future battle or future war that India has to fight from within. So he established the CIJW school in Barangte. And today, it is one of the finest schools that you will find across the world. In 1971, General Sagat, heli-lifted an entire body of troops across the river Meghna and attacked the Pakistanis. He was the one who was responsible for the capture of Dhaka. Mrs. Gandhi is said to have told him that, Sam got me Bangladesh, you got me Dhaka. So General Sagat's role in this book is quite central. Alongside him, again, when you have, so leadership is an essential part of the takeaway from this entire story. When you have General Sagat, you had Brigadier Bakshi, an intrepid brigade commander. You had Colonel Rising, outstanding leadership, 2nd Grenadiers at Nathula, Colonel K.B. Joshi at Chola, and the company commanders and the Jawans. So, it just flowed from the top. So that is something that that I took away during my research. It was fascinating to hear all of that. Then, how does this impact history? In 1986, when the Chinese had sat on the Indian side of the LAC at Sondarongchu, General Sundarji had to rely on the advice of General V.N. Sharma, who later on became the chief. He was the Eastern Army commander at that time. So there was pushback from the ministry in Delhi to General V.N. Sharma that you should pull back because the Chinese are pushing us. So you pull back and then we will see what to do. General V.N. Sharma had objected to that. So he said this, that I had taken an oath to protect the territorial integrity of the nation. If you are asking me to withdraw and leave my ground, you are asking me to go against the oath that I have taken to protect the country. Therefore, if you want me to do so, I will resign now and take you to the court tomorrow. These were General Sharma's words, and that really rattled a lot of people in Delhi. General Sundarji also told somebody who had rung him up that saying that, look, the Prime Minister is not very happy with the way you're taking up the stance. So General Sundarji had told them that, look, I think you must tell the Prime Minister that he's not getting the right advice. So these are the kind of implications of the leadership ethos that was set by General Sagat. That ground leadership is important to convey the right kind of situation to the political leadership, which hadn't happened in 1962. People had complied, and the wrong leadership, wrong decisions followed and led to complete disaster. So 86, just to add to that, so the Prime Minister flew to the place, and he met with the troops as well at that point of time. So he asked the troops, because initially the thought was to pull back and not have a confrontation with the Chinese, but General Sundarji had mounted the troops on top of the ridges and had surrounded the Chinese. So when the Prime Minister asked the troops, and this is an account from one of the generals that I spoke with, that would you want to, the Prime Minister asked that, aage jana hai? He said, yahan rehna hai ya piche jana hai? So the troops said, and this is the response of the troops, one of the JSOs raised his hand. He said, साहब ना तो यहाँ रहना है ना पीछे जाना है, आप हुक्म कीजिए, हमको तो आगे जाना है. Now this kind of reflects the mentality, the aggressive mentality, the positive nature, the confidence of the troops that were there at the border. And to his credit, the Prime Minister smiled, and he acceded to General Sundarji's decision. He had already acceded to him, and he kind of agreed that this was right. So the decision taken at a local commander level is essential to understanding the situation on ground. And General Sundarji's decision was a reflection of what he was a reflection of the military ethos that had been set in store by General Sagat in 1967. He was actually using the Sagat Singh playbook as well. So this is the impact 1967 had on the history that followed. We hadn't, except for 1975 when an Indian patrol was fired upon and Indian soldiers were killed, until this incident in 2020, now when 20 Indian soldiers lost their lives, China hadn't mounted a military offensive against India ever. So that was the start of it. There were several things. You can talk about the 1995 protocols, 1993 and 2005 protocols set in place, the no first use of fire policy. All of that is essential in establishing that peace prevailed over these years. But 1967 was the dominant narrative. And I've always believed that you can attain peace by establishing parity. In 1967, India established the parity against China, and that, to me, was set the tone for re-establishing the India-China narrative in history to follow. So this is something that we have already spoken about. If you see Sikkim and you see the Siliguri corridor, Nepal and Bangladesh, it's very narrow. And Doklam, you can see Doklam in the picture. They captured, they wanted to basically get access to the Jampheri Ridge near Doklam, which would have again enabled them to get a clear shot at the Siliguri corridor and cut it off. Also, you can see Sikkim lodged between, close to China and between Bhutan and Nepal. So it's essentially conveying where the vulnerabilities of that period and why those battles and winning those battles essentially were very important. Almost done with this. This is General Sagat, the man who had won the battles, led India to winning those battles. These brave officers and men. General Sagat, this is an early photo of 1965, I think, when he had been posted to Sikkim. So that's him. I think we are done with the slides. So that is in a sense the book, the process, what led me to write about it, why we haven't known of it, the takeaways, the leadership ethos established, the dominant narrative, and the similarities between 67 and 2020 that we see now. So that was from my side. I thought it'd be good to share my thoughts with you. I would love to hear your thoughts. And just before I finish, I think, this is the book, and the cover of the book is it was a picture I got from Major Bishan Singh. This is about Indian and Chinese soldiers facing off. And this was a few days before the clash actually happened. I showed you another picture. This is another picture of that nature, where you could see the kind of ferocity that existed, the kind of aggression that existed. And this was well captured in the pictures of that period, which I have also had used in my book as well. So this is something that came about, when I pieced together the events. In retrospect, you can almost see the 1967 battles coming. But when you took your mind back to that period, you realize how what a sagacious leadership there would have been. What preparedness, bravery, ability to really confront a situation on ground, the soldiers, the men, the company commanders, the military leadership at that point of time. The impact that it had in history is significant. And I thought this was a story whose time had come, and a story that every Indian ought to know. Thank you.
Prabal, I'll get started with a question here. So, recently, because of Galwan, one has been hearing a lot about the Chinese PLA. What is the nature of the beast? Are they fighting for the party, communism? Are they fighting for China? I mean, I even heard slogans that when they raise slogans, they're raising slogans for allegiance to the Communist Party and to Xi Jinping. It was never about China. So can you share a little bit about that? And there is a connected question to that, which is about the motivations of the soldiers, given if this were true, then the motivations, how are there different motivations, one aligning to political party leadership, one aligning to the nation or a civilization perhaps?
Right. No, great questions, Rahul. I think this is a question that, forms the central core or crux of why China is behaving this way. So I think it's a fantastic question. Just to take a step back, it is all up, and I'll start with the last word that you used, is it civilizational? So it is actually a part of China's overall civilizational goal, which is to become the preeminent superpower, or the greatest power on earth by 2049. It is driven by their central belief in Tianxia, which is a 15th century belief in the Qing dynasty that China, wherein they believed that China was the center of the earth. And Tianxia meant under the heavens. So essentially, China was a kingdom under the heavens, and the emperor of China, or the general secretary, the president, or premier, as one would see now, was the king of the kingdom of God, because it was under the heavens, and that was the center part of the world. So they believe that that is their place that they need to retake. When 1945 happened and the Second World War happened and the multilateral institutions were formed, they were essentially led by the US. China was still fighting its internal war and establishing itself, the civil war. So they felt they were left out of that international order. In 1967, I'm just taking a step back, in 1960, 62, 67, if you look at China, they were also at that point of time, Mao was facing a lot of internal dissent. And that led to the war of 1962. That led to all those actions of aggression in mid-1960s, which was a part of the Cultural Revolution, where Mao was actually isolating himself virtually because of his aggressive actions against not just India, but Soviets and others as well. I'm just drawing parallels. So you see the kind of external projection of internal issues is very paramount, and it's what has happened now also. I'll come to now. If you look at Xi's ascendancy in 2013, after that, India and China have had more standoffs, I think 6 standoffs, than in all the 4 decades collectively put together. So you see the rise in aggression, the rise in Xi's ambitions is much more. To your question about PLA and the Communist Party, Xi actually combined, after Doklam in 2017, in the 2018 Congress, he made sure that the PLA and the Communist Party were both headed by him. The PLA in 2018 in the elections, or their deputies, whatever they have it, 80% of the PLA nominees that were decided were first-time nominees. That also meant that he had complete power over them. He also made sure that General Zhao Zhongqi, who was the military commander during Doklam, was put in charge of 2 commands. Xinjiang and Tibet were 2 separate commands. They were put under one theater command and they were made into one theater command and put under General Zhao. General Zhao is Xi Jinping's man. He was the one who was responsible for Doklam. He was the one who's responsible for this as well. So allegiance, and I'm coming to your question, and General Zhao is aiming to get a position in the CMC, which is a part of the overall central committee. And that position, Xi has created an extra position, and that is what General Zhao is gunning for, and he's trying to impress his boss as well. So this is at the tactical level, what is trying to do. At the more strategic level, yes, the forces are a part of the Communist Party. They are essentially answering to that belief that, look, China is the greatest power on earth, and we must continue to move towards that phase or that position. And that is driving their larger set of actions. It is also manifested in the manner in which China continues, or the Chinese government continues to hide facts. They have not disclosed the names and a number of casualties to its people, because they want to portray that image that though nothing happens to Chinese soldiers. This is something that has also driven them into a state of complete megalomania, as I would put it, for Xi. And this whole drive of it's a civilizational drive, and that civilization, under the civilizational drive comes the communist belief. And under that communist belief comes a military action, which is not soldierly. And that is why you see the actions are not soldierly. No military, no army would, no self-respecting army would resort to the actions that they did on the 15th, 16th night after having the protocol set in place. That would be done by a bunch of hooligans. And that's essentially because they follow the essence of the Communist Party. Also, this is tied to that principle of deception, which is essentially a part of the Chinese strategy in the larger sense. If you look at, decapitating multilateral institutions or hoodwinking others, this is a part of the Chinese strategy, and it's, you can see the manifestations, salami slicing, we can call it territorial grabbing, territory grabbing, etc. But it's led by the overall Chinese belief that anything should and everything needs to be done to make sure that China occupies the center of the earth.
Captain, just a small observation, and especially on the reason why this was almost this 1967 war was kept under wraps.
Right.
Because I find it really amazing. So what I find it amazing is now my dad was in the Air Force, and 67, the year I was born, the first posting where he was, we were in Barrackpur in Bengal. And my dad has told lots of stories about, 1971, 65, everything. But he has literally blanked out 67. Now, is 67 war a total army operation, and that's why it's been kept under wraps? And where, my dad, he always tells me lots of war stories, but he never has mentioned this. And my observation is, the 50s, 60s, and even to almost mid 70s was the time where you had, coups all across the world, where armies were taking over the nation, various nations. So was it one of the reasons where, the bureaucracy and the politicians didn't want to give much, patta to the generals so that, they get some fancy ideas? That's why they kept any victories like 67 under the wraps. And of course, 71, they couldn't do anything, it was a decisive victory, which they had to, proclaim. So just an observation, because this reason sounds very unconvincing, such a major war. We lost some 80 soldiers, 100 soldiers, and they lost some 300 soldiers. It's a big deal, even for 67 standards.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that, Captain?
Sure. Thank you for your observation and question. So, to your first point, the Chinese had threatened to use the Air Force, and that's where the battle was, because they had said that, they had suffered a lot of casualties. They said, if it goes any further, we'd use the Air Force, and, India and the Chinese put the white flag first that, let's come to a truce. And that's where a truce was made. So the Air Force wasn't used. So you're right, it was essentially an army battle, but what happens is when the Air Force is used, and I'm not saying this is a war, these are battles. And once the Air Force is used, the scale goes up because the actions are far more expanded and expansive. So that didn't take place. So it was localized conflict, and that's how it happened. Number two, yes, your reason that, there were coups going around and Indian government was distrustful. That's a pretty good point. I have, one of the things I wanted to understand as to why the battles were never recounted in history, not told all of these years. And my reasons are based on what I understood from my interviews with people, from analysts, from historians, from army officers who were around in that period. And those three reasons, in those three reasons, one of the reasons that I gave you was actually aligned to what you mentioned a little bit. I'll tell you why. When I said the military, it was a military victory. And because it was not a political victory as such, there was not, it happened all of a sudden. You had to take a quick action there, and the military leader, the military commander did take an action there, and we prevailed. So given the lack of adequate political participation in that particular time of 4 days, in Nathula and a day in Chola, it was not taken, it was not recorded, and it was not recounted as much. because the credits were taken, it was it was a military victory. It was the credit was there, on ground military leadership credit. So that's what happened. So why I say it's connected with what you said is also, yes, it's possible that, people take military leadership, the victory of a military leadership as something that, people welcome it and think that, well, this is what a military leader could do, more decisive. Why not? Why shouldn't we have military leaders playing a greater part? Or what if the military leaders themselves think that, they could play a greater part? Well, this could have been true. But, if I were to look back, if 1965 hadn't happened, what had happened was in 1965, the entire military civil leadership equation had changed drastically. And it's important to put this as a reason because, 62, there was a complete gap between how the defense minister Krishna Menon thought and what the military leadership thought, and what the military leadership thought on ground and the top military leadership thought. And whether it was General Kaul or General Thapar at the top level or the military leadership on ground, there was a significant gap between the top military leadership and the local commanders. There was a gap between the civilian leadership, which is the defense minister, and the military leadership, the chief, and General Kaul, who was a war commander. So that gap between civil and military leadership was immense in 1962. That trust had built up in the years that followed, because we had the defense minister Chavan, we had General Harbaksh in the 1965 war, General Jain Chaudhary. So a lot of trust had been reworked, and there was a lot more trust going into that mid-60s period. So given that, I wouldn't think that that may have been the immediate reason. I think the trust that was lost in 62 was somewhat recreated in 65, and that's why when the Prime Minister was asked that, look, I think we should be taking a detour and counterattacking Pakistan, he readily agreed, because the defense minister was not interfering in 65 in the leadership calls taken by the military. I think that trust had been re-established. What also may have been the reason, and this is something that I must say in response to what you mentioned, is that there was a new government that was formed. So that was also there. Mrs. Indira Gandhi had come to power shortly before that. So I think the entire they didn't want to sort of highlight it as much for several reasons at that point of time. It was a new government still taking shape. This had been a victory out of the blue against China, in the middle of relations that were not going well. So all of this sort of added to the reasons. Though I must say that in the years that followed, China had no relations with India until 1969, when they reached out to Mrs. Indira Gandhi at that point of time, and subsequently left. Several things happened leading to 71, and then the leadership again did a great job at both levels. But I think the trust had been reestablished in 65 to a large extent before 1967 happened. It's just that the military leadership took those decisions. They were the ones who carried the day, and that's how it remained.
I have a couple of questions to ask. The first one is, why was Sagat Singh not honored the ultimate military honors? What prevented the government to do so? After all, his decision was monumental, and it has its bearing even today. And shall I ask the other two questions, or?
So I'll just give you a quick response to that. So I've also mentioned in my book that at that point of time, I think what I understand is that General Sagat was a general. He would take his decisions, make that operation a success, and move on. I don't think there was great relations between General Sagat and some of his seniors and superiors at several points of time in history. Maybe that would have been a reason why his achievements were not highlighted as much. One, second, somewhere, I mean, that's something that would have happened. And your question is very valid, because 1971, He was the one who had led the capture of Dhaka. And you'll be surprised, he was not given a gallantry award throughout his career for all these actions. So that's a question I would ask a lot of people as well. I can give you the answer, but even I'm baffled.
My second question is this the right time to annex POK? Because we'll have two objectives achieved out of it. One is getting back the lost territory. Second is forever burying the CPEC project of China.
Right. I think, the question has several elements, that needs to be considered before any such action would be taken. One is and this is something that comes into being over a period of time, and we need to be realistic. Over a period of time, how much have we spent on our defense and how much has China spent on its defense? And we need to understand the military asymmetry of between India and China. And that's not of today. That's gone on over the years. So we cannot suddenly, overturn something that we have not addressed over the years. We have not addressed our military budgets. We have not addressed our modernization. I think at some point of time, and not some point of time, I think that is we're talking about hastening up the purchases of the jets and S-4000 and the missile systems, and we are looking at the various armaments and the Rafales, the Chinooks, and all of that. We need to beef up our infrastructure. We need to have our weaponry in place, before we have any such plans. But coming to your point of the plan, I think there was an old Chinese suggestion that had come in the 50s that you take Arunachal and we'll take Aksai Chin and we'll settle the border. India had at that point of time not taken the suggestion. I think at this point of time, China's project, to my mind, they are stretched at their own levels. They have had a hard time. They have 150 odd countries, out of which half of them cannot repay back the money that they have lent them. So I would think they would fall under their own set of contradictions. The Chinese 2015 security project has a plan of naval expansion by 2030. I would think I would just tilt this a little bit. I would say China wants to take us to the Himalayas, and I've written about this. China wants to take us to the Himalayas, take the dragon to the oceans, because that is where China is weak. Play the game where your strengths are. Malacca Straits, 80% of China's imports come through Malacca Straits. South China Sea, China's fighting, opened up so many fronts. So I think the important part, I would think, is to fight a smart, not fight, take it, have a smarter approach, where you pick on China's weakness, where you play onto your strengths, rather than get drawn into something that, it's like a quicksand, quagmire. You just get drawn in there. So there are areas where you can cut out China. There are areas where you can actually take the oxygen out of that. So that, I think that is where India would slowly be able to achieve its larger goal. And I think one thing to learn from the Chinese, they stay on course to their larger goal of 2049. If we have the patience and have a larger goal in mind, what you're saying, that is something that is a part of our territorial, it's a part of our territory, and it's someday, but I think to achieve that, again, great deal of patience, playing to our strengths, and ensuring that, at some point of time, we're able to achieve what we set out to do, and not get drawn into the enemy's approaches at this point is what I would think is important. Understand where we are strong, where our limitations are, where we could play the game better.
And my final question is it practical, or is it ever possible to get back Aksai Chin?
I think at this point, no. Because as I said, there's asymmetry, and we must look at it from a practical standpoint as well, in terms of the asymmetry that the powers and the military powers, India and China, possess in their own ways. And the fact that, India is today also has a two-front war to combat in case one has to do that. At some point of time in future, as I said, if we have a plan, if we have a strategy, I think in future, a communist state, a dictatorial state would fall under its own contradictions. We should also have a plan. We need to have better, infrastructure the ability to actually go on with that plan. And it's only then that we would be able to take that. And I think, in future, that territory belongs to us. History has a lot of patience if we have one for history. So I think at some point of time, I think we would be able to, but it's at this point, I would think we should be realistic about what our goals are immediately.
There's a question from Alok Tripathi. Is asking on the 67 versus 62 battles. Were the supply lines the same in 1967 as were in 62? That's the question.
I think, there's a nuance that I must present here, which is there in the book as well, briefly, that when General Sagath went to Sikkim in 1965, he realized that the soldiers there in the outposts near Nathula and several of these other places at the higher altitudes did not have the right kind of equipment, did not have the right kind of clothing and equipment. And he made sure, and he really pushed for beefing up their clothing and equipment at that point of time. That's the one part. The second thing is that as far as logistics and infrastructure, did you say? I think logistics and infrastructure or supply lines. That time, no. I don't think India had built up much of supply lines at that point of time. We must also remember that 67 Sikkim was a separate state, and it had its own contention and own funds. India, of course, looked after its defense. But the supply lines of 62 and 67 were literally absent. The one thing that helped in 67 was that it was a localized conflict, and it happened over a few days, and we did not require the kind of supply lines that would have ordinarily been the requirement of a longer drawn out war, which had happened in 62. So no, the answer to your question is no. We've built up infrastructure now, but was not there in that time in the 60s.
Yeah, so Captain, I have two questions. One is related to history. So when the clashes broke out in Nathula and Chola, why didn't Chinese activated their western sector in Ladakh? Second question is a bit political, applying to current times. Is despite the focused aim of China at cornering India in every platform on the world, why is India shying away from joining any alliance for countering China?
Yes, thank you so much. The second question is something that we are all asking each other, but I'll come to that. The first part is more direct. So when that, if you read the battles, about the battles in the book, they had of course things had come to a pass where both sides had been up against each other. There had been few incidents of brawls, etc. But suddenly, when the guns opened up from China, one of the things that had happened at that point of time, and this is something that I say this in retrospect and in response to your question, and it's a good thing that you asked me this question, because it forced me to think why. And to my understanding, and this is something that I felt while writing the book as well, that the Chinese, the confidence, I mean, again, we go back to the context of 1967. It is 5 years after a crushing victory. So when you have a crushing victory under your belt, you think, oh, I have pushed India at Nathula, I will just deliver another crushing victory. So it was like going like a Roger Federer to a local tournament and getting beaten all ends up. So that is what had happened. They hadn't anticipated the kind of crushing blow that India would deliver at Nathula in 1967. That is something that the Chinese had never anticipated. And that's what happens when you become arrogant. There is a lot of hubris. 62 had happened. 1953, they had succeeded against the Americans. So that it was it was a knock-on effect of the confidence that they had had. That look, we are a nuclear. 64, they'd become a nuclear power. 62, they had one against India. 65, they had actually Indian forces. I spoke to you about Nathula, General Sagat Singh occupying that place, that watershed spot, and not withdrawing. India actually withdrew from Jalapla. I mentioned to you briefly what happened at Jalapla. After India withdrew, Chinese came and sat at Jalapla. Till today, they sit at Jalapla. We had withdrawn. Now we have gone and occupied the heights around Jalapla, but Chinese achieved the psychological victory at Jalapla in 1965 by occupying that pass. Now, with all these things behind them, any nation would think that Nathula was a takeover, was something that they would easily defeat India, and that's one of the things that happened. By the time Nathula ended, they had recorded more casualties than India would, 5 times. That was one, and that is why they went after India, Chola again, because they believed that this was a flash in the pan, and they didn't need to move things elsewhere. After these 2 defeats, I think it was a humiliation enough for the Chinese to not really go, and you can see it in 1971. They didn't move their troops in Sikkim. They could have terrorized India. They could have moved their troops. They could have made India commit, but the psychological ascendancy was taken away by India. Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon had urged, the Chinese leaders to push India at the border at Sikkim, just to make India commit. Because General Sam Manekshaw had raised an additional corps, thinking that China might push India at Sikkim. But the Chinese didn't move more than a few 15, 20 soldiers here and there. That's it. Because they were so shaken up by 67. And that was the after effect of it. But at that time, to your question, in 67, they didn't think that India would really stand up to them. And that was a shock and the crushing defeat that they had. By the time Nathula had ended, they didn't know what had hit them for them to really move troops elsewhere. To your point, why India does not, well, I think over a period of time, if you look at it, tables have turned. 1971, when India and Pakistan were at war, Soviets were on India's side, the US was on the Chinese side. Right now, China is isolated. And I have been saying that, in 1971, when India went to war with Pakistan, one of the things that India did was to sign an agreement with the Soviets that, if either one of us is attacked, the other one would come to help. Now, obviously, India couldn't have gone to help Soviet Union in case of their being attacked. So therefore, India was the beneficiary of the treaty, because if China had attacked, the Soviet Union would have threatened China. So that was an agreement that was signed by India and the Soviets. I think the time has come that India needs to have treaties that define the kind of help or assistance that it would seek and it would get from allies. In the absence of definite, sign-ups, it becomes very vague. We are talking about D10, which is again an extension of G7 countries. We are talking about Quad. Quad is essentially an allied assembly of countries that come together against China, which is US, Japan, Australia, India. But they haven't really moved constructively. So what are the terms of these? The terms have to be defined for India to be a part or defining part, a more productive part of these allies. Because, otherwise it remains in the diplomatic courses and conferences and political discourses. But it needs to be defined. If India were to take on China, will the US come to its aid? India needs to be assured of that. The US goes to elections in later this year. What happens? What happens to the US president who gets elected? Will that president be supportive of India and every action that India takes against China? We can talk about blocking Malacca Straits, but India needs to be assured of all these things, because it's a direct neighbor that India has. And India has to face that neighbor. And though I must say that what you're saying is something that I've been arguing, that if there was a moment in history that India had, wherein it had the support of a larger committee of nations and China was on the back foot, this is the moment. China has several holes, several weaknesses, whether it's South China Seas, Vietnam, Philippines, Japan, a lot of these. India, on the other hand, by way of its economic, the market that it has, the fact that, it has Japanese investors withdrawing from China, the fact that it has got America supporting it, is in better space. It also depends to the extent that to what extent that India would go with allies also depends in terms of how much the allies are willing to forfeit some of their trading and other relationships with China in order to be a part of a stronger allied formation. And if they are going to be bullied by China, then you can't have an ally formation that is unified and strong. And India would certainly want people to commit to that formation, and that is why India would want them to be as much a part of it as India is. And I think that is why one of the things that India is looking to find that kind of confidence in the allied formations. There have been allied formations, but they haven't moved. This is a good time for India to lead such a formation in the region, provided it gets the support from its allies.
So, sir, you said that the Chinese civilization, they have that ideology of under the heaven place. Is it really a place, or do they think the more they extend, the more place they will get under the heaven or something like that?
Okay, Shreya has been in touch with us at end. She's 16 years old. So
Right. Great question, Shreya. I think that's a question that should take us back to history and see what they actually meant. When they meant heaven under the skies, heaven under the skies, heaven on earth, or under the heavens, the way you put it, it's a central place under the heavens. What they would do is, they would seek those days. They would get the Vietnamese and the other smaller vassals, the kingdoms, would pay them money. It was like a gunda who would take the hafta from the people in the neighborhood and rule them. That is how they ran this whole heaven on earth phenomena, where the king dynasty, the king would take the protection money from the vassal states of Cambodia, Vietnam, and other places, and in exchange they would say, okay, we will protect you. Today, because other states have become entities by themselves, what China does is, under that belief, it wants to increase its territory. And so you're absolutely right that heaven on earth becomes a larger heaven. And increasingly, it's like an elastic heaven which keeps expanding in size. China is the one country that has been expanding ever since it's formed as a nation. And it has got more disputes with countries than any other nation on earth. And it has been expanding, whether it is South China Sea, whether it is the Himalayas, whether it is the Senkaku Islands with Japan, whether it is the Natun Islands with Indonesia. I can go on and on. It's called salami slicing. So China is the one country that has managed to slice salamis not only on land, but in water also. So it's slicing territories in water, dropping islands, creating. So it's a territorial expansion that it has in mind. It is also a part of their belief and their belief in territory stems from an ancient belief that this is what China is about. They talk about 5 fingers, if you've heard of 5 fingers, and those 5 fingers extend to Arunachal, Tibet, Sikkim. So these are Bhutan. These are 5 fingers that the China believes is theirs. So it's sticking to that, that ancient belief. And for a superpower or a superpower or some country that wants to be a superpower, these are the notions that will lead them to be at constant conflict against the larger world. They might have the smaller states which want to stick by China and become their extensions or vassals, like a Pakistan or somebody else. But I think it will always have that conflict. And with India, because India is another country which has a larger play in the region. And as somebody asked before this, yes, India, in order to play a larger role in the region, India needs to step up, and this is the time for it to do that. China will always be at conflict with a nation like that. So its heaven seems to expand. Territorial expansion is stemming out of its ancient belief that Chinese influence extends over a larger region, and that's what it would be going forward. It's just that their race for civilizational greatness of 2049 is perhaps accelerated by Xi Jinping's ambitions, because he knows that if he doesn't take some of these actions, he might be displaced internally. But in the course of expanding or accelerating that goal of China's, becoming a superpower on Earth by 2049, I think he's probably, lost the control on it, or China's probably lost the control on it. And it's also called the Year of the Rat. This is the Year of the Rat, and since you mentioned civilizational narrative, every 60 years China has the Year of the Rat, and every time there has been the Year of the Rat in China, it has led to disaster. It led to disaster in 1860 or around about 1840 was the first Year of the Rat, and then was 1900 when the Boxer Rebellion took place and all the countries kind of descended on China and captured territories. Then 1960 was the next Year of the Rat when millions got killed by Cultural Revolution of Mao Zedong. 2020 is the next Year of the Rat when a disaster would await. And of course, we have the corona coming out of China. So what happens internally, we'll wait and see. But this is something that is a part of the belief that their territory extends far more than what the political boundaries indicate.
One very quick, very interesting question, and maybe a quick short answer from you. Have we repeated the 1967 moment at Galwan?
I think in some respects they did. They launched the attack before we did. They wanted to keep it local, and and they've suffered as well. Information doesn't come out of China. China never discloses its casualties, but despite the fact that they started the aggression first, they've suffered more casualties. So in more ways than one, yes, they tried to do that, and the results, as I would think, have been similar to 67. They have lost more men than they thought of, and if you look at the disengagement today, and a lot of reasons could be attributed. But one of the things I feel is also the fact that they realized that in a close conflict, they were outmatched again. Despite the fact that they retained the time and place of choosing and the time of surprise and time of inflicting that attack, yet they lost many of their soldiers. So I think yes, there is a similar kind of a thing that they attempted in 2020 as in 1967, and that's why it's relevant.